What's up, everybody, and welcome into the H&M Trucking podcast. We've got another very special presentation of trucking up history for you this week, and it is a doozy. In fact, this one might even lead into a two-part episode where we'll start discussing and diving into the history surrounding Jimmy Hoffa. But first, we need to talk about the Teamsters Union, so please join Denny on this journey to learn all about the Teamsters Union and its involvement with trucking on this episode of Trucking Up History, presented by H&M Trucking. Part 1. A little about unions.
Every group of hardworking laborers deserves proper representation. From protecting those in education to entertainment, marginalized groups across varying workforces to veterans in the labor pool. All unions aim to defend the rights and liberties of workers of the world. In America, unions can be thanked for their contributions to the labor force, and all of us, quite frankly. Weekends, pensions, and health insurance would not exist without the solidarity of unions. As of 2020, 1 in 9 workers in America are represented by a union. Now that's roughly 16 million people. Little over 10 million of those people are part of the communities disenfranchised in the workforce, particularly women and people of color. These marginalized groups depend heavily on unions to support their freedoms in an often unfair system. While most who are represented by unions are in the education and healthcare sectors, around 27%, or 3 in 10 people, 1 in 7 union representees work in transportation. The Teamsters Freight Division represents everyone who works in trucking across America. Mechanics, dock workers, office staff, and of course, truck drivers. Since 1903, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters has been dedicated to working tirelessly to improve the working conditions of transportation workers in both the U.S. and Canada.
Part 2. Beginnings of the Teamsters.
The formation of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, IBT, or simply the Teamsters, was brought about in 1903 when the Team Drivers International Union and the Teamsters National Union merged. In its humble beginnings, the Teamsters core membership consisted of local delivery drivers using horse-drawn vehicles, still represented in the IBT's current logo. These local drivers were, in the words of the Teamsters website, guardians of trade and harbingers of wealth and prosperity in America. Despite their cultural and economic importance, prior to the formation of the IBT, these drivers remained unorganized. Without power in numbers, drivers were heavily exploited. In 1900, drivers typically worked 12 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for on average $2 a day. Worse yet, drivers not only assumed responsibility for their haul, but were also liable for damaged and lost goods as well as bad accounts. All risk and little reward led to 1,700 drivers banding together to create the Teamsters Drivers International Union in 1901, and then breakaway rival group Teamsters National Union the following year. A couple of years later, the leader of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, saw the two separate entities as a waste of energy and resources. Gompers convinced the two unions to meet in Niagara Falls to put aside their differences and form the IBT. After struggling through the early years, lack of labor laws, and companies using antitrust laws against unions, the IBT backed a deadly strike in 1905 against Montgomery Ward in Chicago. The strike erupted due to the company's locking out of union tailors' use of non-union subcontractors. Known as a sympathy strike, the initial strike was started by a small clothing workers' union, but soon spread to every union in the Chicago area. Although the strike was initially directed at Montgomery Ward, businesses across the city and metro areas were affected as soon as the Teamsters walked out. The strike cost 21 lives and around 400 injuries. The strike broke after the IBT's first president, Cornelius Shea's living situation was made public. Support for the strike dwindled after Shea had been found living in a brothel with his 19-year-old mistress, spending most of the strike's duration hosting lavish parties. Not surprising to most, as the Teamsters' early years were notoriously and openly corrupt. But this revelation proved to be detrimental to the union's public image and the strike nonetheless. Post-strike, under the leadership of Dan Tobin, the man who would be the organization's unopposed president for the next 45 years, the Teamsters saw cleanup of their image as well as aggressive organization and expansion. Along with discouraging striking to bring discipline to the union, Tobin managed to encourage employers to sign contracts with their drivers, established regional leadership incubators, and started a magazine for the Teamsters. Tobin also fought to represent many different kinds of drivers under his jurisdiction, including gravel haulers, beer wagon drivers, milk wagon drivers, and deliverymen for bakeries.
Part 3. Transcontinental Delivery.
After bringing together so many different types of local and regional horse-drawn vehicle drivers, Dan Tobin saw that the freight hauling industry was rapidly changing and wanted in on the action. While many saw motorization of vehicles as a passing fad, Tobin saw its potential. He set out to organize the fledgling industry and train union drivers on these newfangled motorized vehicles. In 1912, the first Transcontinental trucking trek was conducted by the Teamsters. Equipped with a motorized truck and a 5-man crew of drivers, the trip to deliver a pallet of olive oil soap from Philadelphia to Petaluma, California started off with a celebratory parade sponsored by the Philadelphia Inquirer. These drivers were seen as pioneers of sorts. Some would say they were akin to cowboys. Life on the road had none of the conveniences of today. No gas stations and truck stops, no padded seats, no shocks on the truck, and no protection from the weather. Despite the conditions, in true Teamster fashion, the drivers pushed through the hardships and delivered the pallet of soap to San Francisco City Hall after 91 days. This inaugural transcontinental delivery began a new era of trucking and transporting goods. The next groundbreaking trip made by the Teamsters was in 1916 to deliver Carnation milk products. After cutting their teeth on the first go-round and improvements in technology, this trip was made in only 30 days. As horse-drawn vehicles were phased out and replaced by motorized trucks, Teamsters resolved to honor their former equine road companions by resolving to keep them in their logo for the rest of time.
Part 4. World Wars.
In both World War I and World War II, the Teamsters played crucial roles in the support of America. In World War I, Teamsters provided a valuable role in the war efforts by transporting troops and supplies from ports to battle lines. Teamsters used their knowledge to provide motor vehicle repair and to teach soldiers how to drive trucks. Women also joined the ranks of the motorized, so to say, and held down transporting supplies and soldiers at home in the U.S. while the men fought overseas. Teamster women also played a pivotal role in delivering supplies and medicine during the influenza epidemic in 1918, shortly after entering World War I, as well as driving doctors to rural areas. They even went as far as helping war and sickness-stricken families with chores along their routes. Post-World War I Teamsters President Daniel Tobin emerged as a prominent labor leader, aimed to grow the Teamsters membership and treasury. During this period, Tobin partook in many jurisdictional battles with other unions, fighting to represent other factions like longshoremen, gas station attendants, even retail clerks. Most notably, he fought to represent beer wagon drivers, a group that continued to struggle greatly after Prohibition. Tobin had previously fought to represent the group in 1913, but lost in favor of the Brewers Union's autonomy. He won the right to represent their union in the early 30s after raids and subsequent restructuring, bringing the Teamsters membership and monetary situation to an all-time high. When World War II rolled around, Teamsters were in a situation to support war efforts even more so than before. Teamster drivers worked both domestically and overseas to support America's troops. In fact, President Roosevelt invited Daniel Tobin to be the U.S.'s first liaison to organize labor and study how British unions helped support war efforts in their country. Upon his return to the States, Tobin urged all unions to put aside their differences by supporting America's no-strike pledge and band together to face the Axis powers. Teamsters also actively supported buying war bonds and managed to raise over $2 million, around $19 million today, in the first 18 months of the war. On top of the war bonds and labor, the union contributed to the war with a bevy of drives, gathering materials like scrap metal and rubber. And given the Teamsters' positive financial standing, Tobin offered President Roosevelt a loan to help towards war efforts. Ultimately, Roosevelt declined but appreciated the display of generosity.
Part 5. The Minneapolis Strike.
Rewind just a bit to 1934 for the Teamsters' most legendary strike. Minneapolis was a major hauling hub in the U.S. and the center of distribution in the Midwest. Thousands of drivers were employed throughout the city, but most were not affiliated with a union, leaving many unorganized and exploited. A small faction of Teamsters, Local 574 in Minneapolis, had been making attempts for years to organize drivers across industries. However, due to the looming powers of anti-union, pro-violence employers organization Citizens Alliance, the Teamsters were unable to organize disenfranchised drivers. After winning a hard-fought strike at a coal yard, Teamsters saw a huge jump in membership and credibility in Minneapolis. Despite this growth, companies around the city still refused to recognize the union, leading to an epic strike. The strike, undiscerning of drivers' industries, began in mid-May. Strikers demanded wage increases, shortened hours, and the right to represent workers adjacent to driving. All trucking across the city came to a standstill, which, due to Minneapolis being a distribution epicenter, led to nationwide effects. As the strike lingered on with no end in sight, the Teamsters established a daily newspaper to keep strikers up to date and organized relief efforts for strikers' families. A special group of union members combed the streets looking for scab trucks and would make an effort to run them off. There was even a women's auxiliary unit comprised of female sympathizers and wives of strikers established to offer support during these trying times. The unit demonstrated outside of City Hall every day, offered their help to beef up picket lines, run a food commissary, and even operate a hospital for injured strikers. Some badass women even fought when cops clashed with strikers. Many union members went back to work shortly after the strike had started as companies agreed to meet their demands. It became apparent pretty quickly that companies had no actual interest in respecting their agreement and ended up firing many of their union employees or discriminating against them. So back to striking it was. Police violence ensued as strikers continued to discourage the scabs that were being bussed into work. There were many incidents of violence during this drawn-out strike, but Bloody Friday was one of the most notable. Police opened fire on a group of protesters after luring them to a street corner with a decoy scab truck. Many were injured, 2 were killed, and the working-class people of Minneapolis were left stunned. As strikes ramped up post-Bloody Friday, so did police and even military presence. The governor declared martial law in Minneapolis and even issued scab truck drivers military permits. Picketing was officially banned in late July. This was seen by unions as an attempt to break the strike, and they planned to get back to the picket lines on August 1st. Rumor of this return caught wind, and the National Guard surrounded union headquarters on July 31st, arresting several prominent union members. In retaliation, Teamsters called a massive rally of nearly 40,000 to push for the release of their fearless leaders. Eventually, the leaders were released and the captured headquarters were surrendered back to the union. This multi-month strike finally came to a close when employers and the Citizens Alliance agreed, for real this time, to meet union demands, including pay increases. The influence of unions was seen across the city and the Midwestern region, and workers spanning many industries started to organize. And ultimately, the Teamsters exited this tough time period stronger than ever, with major increases in membership and credibility. The strike also led to several pieces of legislation that acknowledged the rights of workers to organize and bargain with their employers.
Part 6. Master Freight Agreement, Teamsters, and Mid-Century Politics.
All right, let's jump forward 30 years to 1964, marking another monumental moment in Teamster history. The National Master Freight Agreement was signed, officially protecting 450,000 OTR, local, and regional drivers' benefits and rights. The mastermind of this agreement, Jimmy Hoffa, don't worry, we'll be covering him and corruption in the Teamsters in an episode soon. Anyway, he was the force to be reckoned with, and was even more powerful due to the Teamsters' strong political standing. Many of the union's supporters were doubtful that the freight agreement would ever come to fruition, but Hoffa pushed forward, staunchly believing in the rights of drivers across the country. Thanks to the freight agreement, more drivers and their families were hauled into the middle class and were thus seen as a more actionable group. The agreement didn't just improve drivers' socioeconomic standing, it also improved overall respect for non-craft laborers like truck drivers, allowing them to become a recognized force in politics. Politicians realized drivers held, and still do quite frankly, more power than they'd realized, and started paying attention to their concerns and desires in exchange for secure votes, of course. The Master Freight Agreement made way for the union to sign regular contracts with companies, ensuring steady freight and that labor standards are met. Not only that, but the agreement also allowed for the union to have as equal power as the companies they were entering contracts with.
Part 7. Civil Rights.
Since its inception, the Teamsters Union fought hard for equality in the workplace. Teamsters in the early days would not allow for businesses they were involved with to practice segregation and threatened to pull out of deals when they found instances of it. They also made passionate statements directed at local faction leaders in their Teamsters magazine, asking for integrated and African American-led chapters. Teamster involvement in civil rights did not stop there. In the 50s and 60s, the union donated money, supplies, and political backing to many civil rights groups. They even worked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., representing laborers on civil rights boards and committees, as well as making up a larger number of attendees at the March on Washington. The importance of civil rights involvement from the Teamsters lies in the fact that it was, and still can be, extremely dangerous to stand up for what's right. But the belief in equal pay for equal work has trumped all throughout the Teamsters' history, even in the face of violence. Even today, Teamsters have elected many different caucuses, ranging from Hispanics to the LGBTQ community, to keep an eye on equality in workplaces nationwide.
Part 8, The Decline.
Though the Teamsters have been a hugely influential group in both American labor and politics throughout history, and we still see effects of that influence today, they've seen a decline in prominence since the 70s. Years of jurisdictional battles, the deregulation of the freight industry, and challenges within the Teamsters and externally began a slow deterioration of the union. Even the Master Freight Agreement started to bottom out after the deregulation of the freight industry. Union officials fought deregulation and even made a failed attempt to bribe a Nevada senator, but to no avail. Freight deregulation proved to be catastrophic for Teamsters, as it opened up opportunities for non-union, cost-cutting companies to swoop in, bar unionization, and curb wages. Over 30% of the Teamsters Union became unemployed, and the remaining unionized carriers called to cut wages, work regulations, and hours to match non-union companies. Teamsters are still major players in politics, endorsing both Republican and Democratic candidates, save for this election cycle, adding input to legislation, but the pull is not as strong as it once was, especially given the very public corruption of the union. Stay tuned for that episode. There was way too much to cover here. The Teamsters Union has made great strides for America's drivers, civil rights, and all laborers within the freight industry. Years of hard work and dedication to the people who help America roll forward has paid off greatly. Despite setbacks over the years between the Teamsters and unions in general, 16 million laborers across the country are represented by a union, many of which are part of marginalized groups often overlooked in the workplace.
Thanks for joining us on another special edition of Trucking Up History presented by H&M Trucking. Today's history lesson was read by our very own Denny Stone. Don't forget to go check out the new website to get your hands on everything H&M Trucking Podcast. podcast.hmtrucking.com. Stay fresh, cheese bags. We'll see you next week.